In February 2008, Kosovo declared independence from Serbia. While the decision to break away was heavily contested, with over half the UN refusing to recognise it, including Russia and China, it had support from the United States and almost all the members of the European Union. However, despite hopes that Kosovo could move beyond its troubled past, it still faces considerable problems nearly 2 decades later. Racked by political instability, relations between the majority Albanians and minority Serbs are beset by mistrust. At the same time, efforts to normalise relations with Serbia have stalled, and relations with the United States and European Union are at their lowest point ever. So, what exactly has happened, and is there a way forward? To discuss all this, I'm joined by Bronwyn Jones, a journalist and commentator based in Kosovo's capital, Pristina. So, hi, Bronwyn. Thank you so much for joining us for this. I think perhaps the best place to start is to give a little bit of an overview of how Kosovo developed after it declared independence in 2008. Because, I mean, we'll talk about the current political confusion, but it might be interesting just to give viewers an overview of how it's developed and what have been some of the main trends that we've seen on the political scene in Kosovo?
Well, after 2008, it was kind of interesting because Kosovo had was being the prime minister was of course Hashim Thaci at that time. He's the one who declared independence, and he came from a generation of men and politicians who had been in the war. So these were the commanders, these were the soldiers who had all been in the war. They created their political parties, and they were the ones who took control of Kosovo up until that point. And they'd been in control before, and they were the ones who seemed to, and they were also quite young as well. These were people in their 40s. So these are not people, now they're in their 50s, but, this is still a very prime age for being a politician. What happened was, though, is there was a movement called Vedvendosje. First, it was a movement, then it became a political party, which was run by Albin Kurti. And Albin Kurti was a student political leader during the time of Milosevic. He was in jail for it. So he was not part of the KLA necessarily, or the Kosovo Liberation Army. He was not part of the men who had fought militarily. Instead, he was in jail for being an activist. But he was also, from that position, able to really challenge their authority. Because before 2008, of course, Kosovo was run entirely by the UN mission in Kosovo. I mean, it was nominally in charge, but there was also a local provisional government. But what happened was that Turkey took a very different line to compromising with international authorities. So he, the motto of that Vendosio became no negotiations. So no compromise on the sovereignty of Kosovo. He didn't like any of the prevailing political leaders, which was very political elite, were very settled into a way which some people would describe as corrupt, as taking advantage of their relationship with the international community to get the money, to get, to run NGOs, to do other things, and he did bring up a very good point, which is that they needed something different and that Kosovo was not progressing economically. For some people, it was progressing economically very well. For other people, not very well. So most people, not very well. So he did bring up all of these things, and he was really influential, particularly with young people people in the diaspora who had left Kosovo and were in Europe. So about 700,000 people from Kosovo are in the diaspora in Europe. That's what we roughly think. So it's quite a big, influential group who also send a lot of remittances back to Kosovo. And, and eventually there became a larger middle class who was also very not so happy with the old leadership. And so then uh, he was able, through, he became a political party and they pushed him quite a bit. And through that pushing, eventually they took over the leadership of Kosovo. So now Albin Kurti is the acting prime minister. After the last elections, he was prime minister and he served a full mandate for 4 years.
It's often seen that Albin Kurti, we can talk about relations with the Serbs in a minute, but maybe from an internal domestic point of view, what has his track record been like? Because he did come to power, as you say, as somebody who said he was going to shake things up, that you had this leadership who'd essentially been in military leadership in the KLA. You mentioned Hashim Thaçi. And there was a push back against these people, and then Kurti came to power. But what has been Vetëvendosje's record since they've been in power? Have they managed to shake things up in the right way? Deal with things like corruption, improve the economy, all these things that they said they were going to be doing?
Well, no. In short, they did not. Uh, what Vetëvendosje and Kurti ran on was reforms. We're going to reform the education system. We're going to reform the health system. And I should say that the education system is one of, according to OECD results, is one of the worst in the world. So the health system, which is extraordinarily poor as well. He was going to reform, do more infrastructure, do more things that were going to help people. He was also going to bring the dialogue back from between Pristina and Belgrade to Pristina and Kosovo or Mitrovica North. So to really talk with and bring in the Serbs who live in Kosovo. That was his big selling point to minority communities, particularly the Serbian community. And a lot of people really bought into that and felt that this is a great thing that could push the dialogue along, that could make an agreement that would be satisfactory. Because of course, many people think here that Serbs are, just enthralled to Vucic and that's it. And they'll do anything that Vucic tells them. But there is a very, very significant core of Serbs, ethnic Serbs in Kosovo, who were very anti-Vucic and felt that the Serbian state wasn't really helping them. However, putting that aside, he said, to do good governance in Kosovo. And he was going to help the people. And they were a left-wing party. And he said he was going to change all of these things and make them better. Demonstrably, he hasn't. That's basically the situation. He hasn't done that. He accused particularly the party that was in control before PDK of being only interested in making new roads and making new highways and not caring for people. Well, he hasn't made a new highway. He hasn't made a new railway. The roads the traffic is quite bad in the mess still. However, he did not do anything for education whatsoever. He did not do anything for women, so women were a large group of his voters. He promised to do more for the LGBTQ community and get the civil code to recognize same-sex marriage. He is not. That's partly because Vetëvendosje also has coalitions with very socially conservative parties who are very much against any change to the civil code. So, but we'll see how it goes, because this is one of the things that Kosovo needs to do, recognizing same-sex marriage, guaranteeing the rights of LGBTQ individuals to get into Europe and to show that they are part of Europe. So, no, every time an international independent test comes out regarding education, Kosovo is generally one of the lowest scores in the world, globally, not just in Europe. Same thing for women's rights. So it creates a huge dissonance between what he said he was going to do and what he has done. And what he has done is actually not speak to the Serbian community. He has no dialogue with the Serbian community, despite the protestations that they do, and that they talk to people without telling you who they are, this sort of thing. almost anyone from the political elite and the ethnic Serb community, from the civil society, will tell you we have never spoken to anyone in that government ever. And so this is something that has been extremely difficult. But what he has done and what he's running on essentially now is the fact that, according to them, they have controlled the North. They have conquered the North. And before he came into office, there was, um, there was a modicum of independence for the four municipalities in the north: Zečan, Leposavić, North Mitrovica, and Zubin Potok. They generally had Serbian institutions like the post office there, and the relics, I would say, of Serbian institutions from before the war. They were still existing 25 years after the war. Now, it is very true that Kosovo needed to integrate these. And this was foreseen through the Brussels Agreement, which was in 2015, that they would give the Serb communities the Association of Serbian Municipalities. That would include the four in the north and, of course, the ones in the south. So that would be about 10 municipalities where they would be able to get funding from the Serbian government, but which would go through the Kosovo government, and that they would be, and of course, it's constitutionally required that they keep their own schools, their own healthcare, and this sort of thing. And their institutions, like the post offices, like their banks, this sort of thing, would eventually be integrated through to the government through negotiation. Kurti ripped all that apart and has basically forced many of these institutions, if not almost all of them now, to close, except for schools and education so far. So by doing these things, and I haven't even gotten to that, the police, of course, walked out. 600 police officers, Serbian police officers, walked off the job in the north. 194 judiciary, around 150, 190 judiciary officers in the north walked off. And this was the police and the judiciary were the only parts of Kosovo which were integrated with Serbs. So in the north, they all left. In the south, it's different. What happened was that he moved his own police in, which were ethnically Albanian, which is, of course, against the constitution to have a police force which does not reflect the population. And by doing this, it created an atmosphere of that we are in control now, and we are going to do what we want to do now. The police officers did not speak Serbian. They would come wearing ethnic Albanian symbols, very harsh symbols, like the Punisher symbol, which, is, they were accused of police brutality. There was a man who was shot, and the police officer got 3 years for attempted murder. And then there was even high-level executives at NGOs would claim that they were beaten by the police. Lawyers were claiming they were beaten by the police. So everybody has a story in the north of police abuse. But for Kurti and his followers, who are extremely, I don't want to use the word rabid, but let's say big fans. They see this as the crowning point. We finally took over the north. We finally kicked out all the Serbs. We finally kicked out the Serbian criminal gangs who are running the north.
It's obviously it's been a very complex situation, and it's evolved. And I, as somebody who's also followed Kosovo for a long time, I found it really interesting to see that after it declared independence, you had this process that was led by the European Union on dialogue. We all thought that things were moving in broadly the right direction. It wasn't always smooth, and it wasn't always implemented right. But Kurti seems to have really, to use the British term, thrown a spanner in the works of all of this. I think there's two sort of things that I'd come to. The first is, what has been the international response to all of this? Because they really invested in trying to make Kosovo a success. We know that it isn't fully recognised. It's not even recognised by roughly half the UN. How have they responded to what Kurti's been doing?
Well, the EU is concerned, as they say, and there's a nice Twitter account that says the EU says it's concerned, and the EU has said it's concerned several times. The Quint, which is the United States, France, Italy, Germany, and UK, which are the countries which take a leadership role in Kosovo in terms of the international position. It has also been very vocal about saying every single time something happens, particularly in the north, of decrying these unilateral, uncoordinated actions. However, up until now, there hasn't been huge, what I would say, consequences. The biggest consequence, of course, is the fact that the EU put quote unquote measures. They don't want us to use the word sanctions, financial measures on Kosovo, taking away certain funds, and considerably funds for infrastructure and for cultural funds. So these were mostly IPA funds, or what you call them. I forget exactly what it means, but for those areas, they did not want to take away funds necessarily from civil society. So they haven't really taken away a huge amount of funds for civil society. However, the problem is, of course, the biggest employer, the biggest funder of civil society is still the Kosovo government. So if you take away all these funds from the Kosovo government, that's going to have a knock-on effect. Some governments in the EU, this was unilaterally decided 2 years ago by the EU. All 27 member states agreed to do this. They did not put any similar measures against Serbia, because of what some governments have called Serbian interference. But particularly with the Bansko attacks, which was when there was a terrorist attack at the Bansko Monastery in the north, and the deputy leader of the Srpska Lista political party, which is associated with Belgrade, Milano Dojkovic, claimed that he got together a group of people, a group of men. They got weapons together, and they were going to do who knows what. Actually, we actually don't know exactly what they claimed they were going to do, but they got caught with the weapons before whatever they were going to do, and they were in the monastery, so that's why it's called the monster attack. And they went to the monastery, actually, I should say they fled to the monastery. Then after some negotiations, many of them fled to Serbia, so they just went over the mountains to Serbia. So this is when the measures happen, after that attack, after all of this happened. And some governments, particularly Germany, was thinking, well, it doesn't seem really quite fair to punish the Kosovo government and not to also punish the Serbian government. However, I think, according to I think the French, I'm not speaking for the French, but I think the French would say, well, look, that happened. Radojic says he did it on his own, but all of these things sort of keep happening in Kosovo and we keep saying, please don't do this. Please don't go without telling. For instance, ULEX, the European Union mission that monitors rule of law in Kosovo, they would go and they would do things without telling them. They would go and do things. The Kosovo police would go and do raids in the north without telling them, or without telling people. There was worry about whether these raids were legal, but the Kosovo police refused to coordinate fully with some of these entities. So this became, a real discussion within the EU. So should we lift them gradually, because it doesn't seem to be doing any good anyway? It doesn't seem to be stopping them, or should we keep them on? Or is it fair because Serbia is not also being punished as well, because Serbia hasn't lived up to necessarily its side of the obligations as well? The Serbian position has silently sort of been like, yes, we don't like it, but we're not going to stop it. And that sort of puts the EU in a different kind of situation, because when I was in Brussels last year having a background discussion with some EU officials about this, they would say, well, yes, we know that Vucic is a very bad guy, but at the same time, he actually is very cooperative with us on Kosovo, whereas Turkey isn't. So it's a difficult situation.
The interesting from an outside point of view is, we're now well over a decade and a half since Kosovo declared independence, really coming up for 2 decades now. What is the attitude of Serbs within Kosovo? Because of course, we tend to think of Kosovo Serbs, but there seems to be 2 very different communities. You've got the north, where, as you said, they're congregated in these 4 municipalities. But in the south, it's a rather different situation. I mean, for anyone who might not be aware, it might be quite interesting just to sort of explain about the communities, especially in the south. But as I say, what tends to be the overall view of ordinary Kosovo Serbs now? Do they essentially accept independence but say, look, we want to have our own administrative structures? Or is it still very much a rejectionist position?
Well, it's half and half, I would say. There's a lot of younger people who've grown up during the war, after the war, or kids during the war, who are now adults now, younger people who accept the fact that Kosovo is Kosovo. They may not like it. They would wish that somehow that could change, but that's not going to change anytime soon. And they've come to be like, okay, this is the situation. These are the cards. I have to deal with the cards I have on my table. There's also other groups, some younger as well, but also older people. And there's a lot of older, particularly in the South. So in the South, it's really moved heavily towards pensioners, um, and but also in the North, where they're like, no, I'm a Serb. I've been a Serb all my life. This is my government. Alexander Vucic is our president. We don't care. We will never, you know, deal with anything in Pristina. I would never go to Pristina. This kind of very rejectionist attitude. Also blaming, the international community for recognizing Kosovo, particularly the UK, for some reason. And they say we'll never leave. We'll always just simply die here. And they can do, because the Serbian government gives them a very nice pension, which comes here and keeps them in a very decent, a much better pension than they would get from Kosovo. So, for instance, I think it's 300 euros as the basic pension from Serbia, 100 euros is the basic pension from Kosovo. So you can see the difference. And some people get both, but in the South, it's different in the sense that, yes, you have to be more a part of the Kosovo system. In the North, you could sort of say, look, I reject everything. I don't have to deal with anything. That's the end of it. However, because they use, of course, the dinar was used up until last year. Well, the dinar is still used, to be quite frank, but it was barred up until last year. But in the South, they've had the plates for about 10 or 15 years. They've had to use Kosovo plates on their cars. Whereas this only happened really in the last year and a half in the North, that people really were forced to have to get Kosovo plates, otherwise they would get fines or the car would be taken away. But, I was talking to a young woman from Kachanica, and she's saying, look, she said, we've had to suffer with this situation for years. And so those people up there, they should do the same things we do, and they'll have to do it, just like we have to do it. Because the situation is, this is a separate country, whether you like it or not at this point. The border is there. It's not really an administrative borderline, it's an actual border. However, for many people here, but also for some Albanians too, you have to remember there's also questions of sovereignty. There's also questions of we want to be part of Albania, which we were barred from being part of Albania as well. But yeah, in the South, tend to be much older people who live in the south, and it tends to be a much more rural population as well. Majority north is the only place where you can say it's an urban center, which is dominated by Serbs. Having said that, it's still a very multi-ethnic. So you have Albanians who live there, Roma who live there, Garani, um, Bosnians. So you have different. It is much more multi-ethnic. The only city that would kind of rival that in Kosovo, like Mitrovica North, would be Prizren. So Prizren has also got more of a multi-ethnic feel, although not Serbs.
I mean, I want to talk a little bit more about the minority communities in a minute, but I think I guess my sort of returning to, if you like, the big picture politics of this, where do things go now? So, I mean, you paint a picture of a government in Kosovo under Albin Kurti, which has been enforcing Kosovo's power, authority, sovereignty over the north. Serbs who seem to be becoming more and more used to that, whether or not they like it. But it's very heavy-handed, a picture that Serbia seems to sort of grudgingly accept this. But how do we get to, if you like, a final settlement? Because we still have this situation where Kosovo isn't recognized on the international stage. What is the thinking in Pristina these days? Because, you know, some I'm sure would say it doesn't really matter. We've got support where it counts. We don't need to go further. But of course, it isn't a member of the United Nations. It's question about whether it can really join the European Union when it isn't recognised by all the EU members. There's obviously 5 countries that still don't recognise it: Spain, Romania, Greece, Slovakia, and Cyprus. So where do things go from now? Because Kurti doesn't seem to want to be in a position to compromise. There are there are plans on the table. For example, an association of Serbian municipalities. Um, where do we stand at the moment with all this?
At the moment, it's at a stalemate. Kosovo claims it's ready to join the EU and NATO. And you'll have some politicians say we can join NATO by the end of the year, which they can't join NATO by the end of the year because so many countries in NATO don't recognize Kosovo, like Spain, for example, which is the same problem with the EU. And the leading political, what they will say is it's not fair because we should be a leading country. Kosovo did put in its candidature papers last year, I believe, so to join the EU. But the problem is that you also have to respect rule of law. You also have to respect minority rights. You also have to do all of these things, which Kosovo does not want to do, at least not in the way that the EU would expect it to do it. I think the German ambassador here very explicitly said, hey, if things don't change, your candidacy for the EU will be put aside. And Kosovo is the only country in the Balkans which is not a candidate country for the EU. Serbia is still seen as a leading candidate country for the EU, leading, but there's, with a lot leading, carrying a lot of weight there. But the question is Kosovo willing to do the things that it really needs to do? Some academics and some experts will say to you, well, Kosovo is aligned with EU foreign policy on Russia, on Ukraine, this sort of thing. But the problem is not that. The problem is, how does Kosovo treat its own people inside its own country? And that's not just Serbs. It's also Roma, for example. It's also Turks and Bosnians and the rest. So all of these people, all of this has to be recognized as really important, and it's not. We talk a lot about how the rule law is broken, particularly with minority communities, but we don't talk about how it's also broken with majority communities as well, and how these issues also have to be dealt with women, with, as I said before, the LGBTQ community, and that's what helps scuttle Kosovo's candidacy to the Council of Europe. So when the Ukraine war started, Russia was out of the Council of Europe. So this was an opportunity to get Kosovo into the Council of Europe without that Russian objection. And, and really, particularly Germany, as state, was really pushing Kosovo to go into the Council of Europe. They wanted to see it. France wanted to see it. Everyone wanted to see it happen. At the very last hurdle, they said, "But we want you to sign this guarantee that you will send to the Constitutional Court a draft plan, the European Union draft plan for the Association of Serb Municipalities, which they had refused to implement, which is still refused to implement." And Kurti's government said no. So that's how deeply they will refuse to to do it. And of course, it did not get into the Council of Europe. There was a lot of bother with it here. It well, I believe it hurt Kurti and Veteran Dossier in the election. It did not really damage them enough so that they are not still the leading party. They still received the majority of votes, and but they were not able to form a government though this time, and that's what they were looking for, was to form a government themselves.
And hence, the fundamental political crisis that we see in Kosovo at the moment. How many rounds of voting is it running at the moment for trying to form a government?
Well, they finally did it. They finally elected a parliamentary speaker, I believe, after the 56th or 57th round. So, and this took the intervention of the Constitutional Court, which said that they had to actually use different people. They were using the same person constantly, when she was constantly being rejected, but they refused to change. So the Constitutional Court stepped in and said, okay, you can only do this 3 times. So finally, after the 57th time, they finally elected someone. However, they still can't form a government because they cannot right now agree how to vote on the deputy speaker. The deputy speaker needs to be a Serb. But Veteran Dossier, particularly in all the parties, really are particularly against Srpska, calling it a terrorist party, and saying it's behind a lot of the criminality and terrorism they claim is happening in the north. I mean, so they say that they will not vote for a Srpska member. However, there's only one Serbian member, a guy named Nina Vlasic, who is not a member of the Srpska, but then he doesn't have the support of the minority party of Srpska. This is a constitutionally, mandated thing. They have to do this. But for some reason now, it seems to be felt, or it seems to be okay now to say that we will not live up to these constitutionally mandated.
I mean, obviously, there's so much I'd love to talk with you more about, but I think as a final question for now is that, and I know this is something that you are very interested in, you work very closely on, is that we think of Kosovo as essentially about the majority Albanians, who I roughly make up about 90% of the population, and then the Serbian community. But as you've already pointed out, there are these other minority communities, and they really don't get enough attention. I mean, it'd be really interesting if you could perhaps just give us a bit of an idea of who these other communities are, and what are some of the fundamental problems that they face, and maybe are neglected not only by the Albanians, but also by the Serbs in Kosovo.
Well, the Roma, Ashkeli, and Egyptian face the same issues that you'll find across Europe. But and we say Roma, Ashkeli, and Egyptians, but the Ashkeli and Egyptians tend to be Albanian speaking. Roma, some Serbs, some Albanian speaking. So you have it's similar. Early marriage, lack of educational opportunities, lack of employment opportunities, extreme poverty. So all of these issues are huge issues with those communities, and many of the Serb communities, particularly in the north, go to school in the Serbian system, and where it is also segregated. Quite a few schools throughout Kosovo, Albanian or Serbian, whether you go to the Kosovo system or you go to the Serbian system, are segregated by for Roma, Ashkeli, and Egyptian kids. So they will go to school, say, in the afternoon, and Serbian kids will go to school in the morning. And this is extremely problematic for obvious reasons. Many of them don't obviously get the same kinds of education that a Serbian student would get or an Albanian student would get. Even in Prizren, when you saw, when you see schools are in Klina, when you see schools are mixed, there are still issues with education opportunities. There's also there's Bosnian community, Iranian communities, which is a Slavic speaking Muslim group, Turks, and then of course there used to be Croatians. The Croatians are no longer really in Kosovo. So many of them have left to live in Croatia. And depending usually on what language they speak, on how they view themselves, it depends on whether they choose, quote unquote, the Serbian side or whether they choose, quote unquote, or whether they just live in the middle of all of this sort of rubbing along the way. But even Bosnians, you see that they're leaving. So these groups are almost becoming, particularly with, like, I would say with Bosnians and Croats are gone already, Bosnians, it's negligible how many of them are here. And it's happening, of course, across the population. So about 30,000 people a year leave Kosovo. We know this. This year, for instance, in Leposavic, which is in the north, there might be 40 Serbian students starting high school this year. So these groups, along with the Albanians, are leaving, which is true. But the question really is, are they going to are they going to come back? Whereas with the Albanian groups, you can imagine that if Kosovo was more economically stable and was growing, that there could be perhaps the export coming back. On the other hand, with the other groups, I'm not so sure that would be the case.
Bronwyn, look, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. I mean, obviously the situation in Kosovo is very complex in all sorts of ways, and just simply not getting the amount of exposure. I think with everything else that's going on, the events in the Balkans. So it was really great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great talking to you.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more interviews you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.